order to do just a few API calls and in order to just practice, we will be working with different playgrounds during this course. And our first playground is called http-bin.org. So if you open it, you will be able to find a set of testing APIs that we can use. And those APIs can be called from Postman or any other app that allows to make API calls. And those APIs are just for the testing purposes. So http-bin.org is just a website that was created for QAs and for developers, so they can practice and they can play with different APIs. And this is where we're going to start. So we're going to start with making just simple API calls. And http-bin.org is a very good resource for simple calls. All right. Now, at first, the first thing that I want to do is just practice making a request. So in order to do that, I have http-bin.org open, and I also have Postman installed. So when I open my Postman, this is basically how it looks inside. If you open it for the first time, you will see something similar. You will not see these collections that I already have. That list will be empty for you, but that is not important. We will be working with this tabs functionality that allows us to make API calls. If you downloaded the Postman, open that, and you don't see a tab like this, and you see something similar to this interface, just click on this plus button, and that will just create a new tab. So in this tab, you can create API requests and basically send them using the send button. All right, so let's begin. And let's start with just a few very simple requests. So before we get into Postman, just a quick reminder, when we work with websites or mobile apps, they make API calls themselves, right? And we can actually see that. So basically the goal of API testing is to make API calls through the Postman, right, through this interface, get back the responses, and validate that responses that we are getting back are actually correct. That's the whole goal. Today, we're not going to do any kind of testing. We're just going to start with practicing. So at this point, we're just going to learn how to do different API calls and what kind of information you can pass. But then in our next lesson, we will actually use that functionality, and then we will do some testing. But for now, let's just practice. And let's start with a few very simple requests. So when I first opened http-bin.org, this is how this website looks. And it has a lot of APIs. In order to view them, you actually need to click on them. So if I click on this HTTP methods over here, it will open all kinds of documentation about the APIs that are available. So under each of these methods over here, if I click on every one of them, I will be able to see the information about the call and what this particular call is returning, what kind of information basically needs to be passed in order to do this API call. So this, what you're seeing here, is basically a backend documentation that a developer or a QA engineer needs in order to make an API call. And this is actually crucial for API testing. Without having the information on how to make an API call, we basically cannot do it, right? So in order to make an API call, we have to know the URL, we have to know the method, and we also need to know the data that it is expected to be sent via that call if the data is supposed to be sent. So API testing actually always starts with getting the documentation from developers so we can actually perform these API calls and validate the information that we get back. So I'm going to start with this call. It's called get, and I will try to replicate this call in Postman. So what this website tells us, this is http-bin.org, and the base URL is http-bin.org. So base URL is something that we will always put when we are calling a certain URL, when we are calling a certain API. So the first thing that I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy this, go to my Postman, and in here, I'm just going to enter http // and paste the URL. So this is just the beginning of our call. That's the first part. Now, after the base URL, we always need to put the endpoint that we are calling. So in our case, this is the endpoint /get, right? So /get is basically where we are pointing particularly in order to make this call. So if I want to do this API call, the next thing that I need to do in my Postman, after / I need to add the word get. So this is what we need to do. Now, by default, when you just open the new tab in Postman, the HTTP method over here is selected and pre-selected, and it is get. If you want to do any kind of other HTTP method, you just select it here from the dropdown. In our case, we are making a get call. This is what we see over here, get. And that's the verb that we just select here. Now, if I make this call, let's go back here. If I make this call, I expect to get back status code 200. This is what this documentation basically tells me. In the response, I should get back status code 200. And then in the response, I should also get back the information about my request. This is, again, just a testing API, so it just returns something by default. Usually in normal life, when we use get, we get back some information about something we're looking for. So for example, if you are going through a commerce website and there is a get call to get the products information, in your response body, you will see all the information about all kinds of products that are available on that e-commerce websites and so on. But for now, again, this is just a testing API, so it has a default response. It's just gonna return the request information and request query parameters. So let's just make this API call and verify what we get back. So in order to make the API call in Postman, you can just click on the send button, or you can also hit the keyboard enter button, and the API call will be made. Just make sure that your cursor is over here in the URL. Now, after I make this first API call, this is the information that I get back. First of all, I can see that I get back status code. and status code is 200. So we can see status code over here under Postman, and Postman actually has this tooltips. They're very helpful. So if you move your mouse over the certain status code that you see in Postman, it will always show you the description of what it does. Postman also tells us how long it took in order to make this request and get a response. And over here, on this one part, we always see what we get back in the response. So body is just the information that server sent back to us. Under headers, we see some information that came to us from response headers. Usually just has some additional information about the response itself, like server name is a very common one, date, and so on. So if I look under body of this response, this is basically the information that I'm getting. Again, this is just a testing API, so it just returns me all the headers that I've sent when I made that request. And it also just shows some arguments. Right now they are empty, but over here we will see some query parameters if we add them to the request. So this format that you see over here is a JSON. And JSON is just one of the formats that we can use in order to pass the data. And it always will have the key and the values. So for example, post here is the key and this is the value. Postman token here is the key and then this is the value. So that's basically how JSON is organized. Now, when I made this API call, I only selected the method get and I only input that URL, right, in order to make this call. Now, if I actually click over here under headers, you will see that there are actually 7 headers that were sent when I made those this API call. And that is because by default, Postman actually adds some additional headers. And all these headers, my API actually returned back to me. So I can see all of them returned over here. So in the headers of the request, we can just provide some additional information and the server will receive it. So that's pretty much it. That's the very first API call that we can make. Now, let's go back here. So there are different ways to actually pass data when you work with APIs. And one of the good and common ways to do it is actually by using query parameters. So in this API call /get that we just made, there's actually functionality that allows you to pass some query parameters, and then those query parameters will be just displayed back to you. Again, at this point, we are just practicing. So let's just modify this URL, this API call actually, and add some query parameters. So in order to do that in Postman, go to this tab, params, and here you can just enter query parameters. So the behavior of your API will be changed. Now, keep in mind that not every GET call actually supports query parameters. So when you start testing an API, you will receive the documentation from the developers. And if a certain API supports a query parameter, that information will be there. Which parameter it supports, it also will be there. So you always know when you start testing which parameters you can add to a certain API call and how that particular parameter should modify the response that you're getting. So let's just add a couple of parameters. Let's say we're trying to make a GET. And we want to add a parameter, let's call it limit. And the value of it is, for example, 2. So limit is actually very common query parameters that a lot of developers use. And this query parameter is often used on all kinds of e-commerce websites or all kinds of websites or mobile apps that have basically the functionality to keep on pulling some search results or some maybe newsfeed results. And limit is basically usually used in order to clarify exactly how many results we want our server to send us. So for example, if we are searching for something, we have some sort of query to search for something, by providing the limit parameter and setting it to 2, we're basically saying that we only want first 2 search results to be returned, and that's how it's usually used in regular life. In our case, we're just playing, so let's add the limit here, send this API call. And after we do that, you can see that this API just displays it back to us. So we basically can see that limit is here, and our server understood this query parameter. Now we can have multiple query parameters, and let's add another parameter, for example, city, and send it over here. So if I add that parameter, you can see that server understands that as well. And now we actually have city over here displayed, and it says it is San Francisco. So that's how you can pass parameters using Postman. Now, when you add query parameters to the URL, to the request, they will always be displayed in the URL, and they will always go after question mark. So we basically have the base URL here, the endpoint /get, and then all the query parameters will go after the question mark. Now, if there are multiple query parameters, you will basically separate them like this. So if I add another parameter, let's say page, for example, I want to show a certain page number. You can see that it is also added automatically over here to your URL, and Postman actually does the magic for you and properly creates this URL, so all the query parameters are here. Now, in order to add query parameters in Postman, you can actually modify the URL itself, right? You don't actually have to use these params. You can just add the parameters in the URL. So if I add the question mark and say param equals, right, you will see that Postman will automatically recognize that as a query parameter, and it will actually appear over here. So these check marks over here are very helpful. They allow you to turn on and off different parameters. So if you are testing a certain endpoint that allows adding a bunch of different parameters, that is usually very helpful. For example, we will be during this course testing an endpoint for a weather website, and that endpoint allows to add multiple parameters such as cities where you want to look the temperature, such as the amount of the results, and units in which you're gonna get the temperature, like Celsius or Fahrenheit. And this functionality of Postman actually allows us to add and remove parameters without any issues. So let's add a couple of parameters back. And one more thing that I want to show you here is that when you make an API call, so for example, when you trying to make an API call like this, Postman is actually very powerful, and it actually helps you to make this API call, although it may not even look correctly to some developers. So for example, what I mean is that when we make an API call, we actually cannot have spaces. You can't have spaces in the URL, things just will not work. And in order to make an API call like this parameter that has spaces inside of it, it needs to be included. So when you enter a parameter over here in Postman, even if you enter it with spaces, Postman will actually handle that for you, and it will send that API call properly. It will automatically encode that when sending. So it looks like it actually has a space, but when Postman is sending it, it actually doesn't. Now, you can always encode the parameters yourself. So for example, if I just do the right click on this value of the parameter, you will see that Postman has this functionality to encode the component. So if I click on it, let's just select it and encode the component. And then if I click on it, you will notice that this parameter will be modified, and this will replace the space. And this is actually the proper encoding. So every time Postman is making an API call, although over here you see a space, Postman actually automatically encoding that parameter, and it automatically adds this. So when you make an API call, it is correct. So if I just hit enter, you will notice that the parameter was sent correctly. The city is set to San Francisco, and then the second parameter was also received. So this is how you can make a GET call. Now, you can find a little bit more information about encoding. I added the link to our slides over here. W3 Schools has a very, very good resource about encoding and just some practices, right? URLs cannot contain spaces over here. And you can find all the possible characters here and how to encode them on this website. So if you ever need to do that manually, you can just find this information online and do your own encoding. But the easiest way to do it is just basically use Postman, right? And over here, let's see, oops. When we add something that is not supposed to be sent easily over the URL, we can just do the right click, encode, and all those characters will be properly encoded for us. So you can see that out of the characters that I entered, the ones that cannot be used in the URL were automatically encoded. And now if I make this API call, you will see that they are sent properly, and the response contains the correct information. It's exactly what I've entered here. So this is how you can send different query parameters. All right, now just a quick heads up, with Postman, you can actually make requests to all kinds of resources, and it doesn't actually have to be a certain API call and just an endpoint. It can be just a URL itself. So for example, if I go to Postman and just get http://bin.org, which is not an endpoint, but just the website itself, Postman will actually return me the HTML of this page. So if I go to preview over here, you will see the HTML of the whole web page. So you can actually get web pages through Postman, and the HTML that is returned, you will be able to see in here. So pretty is just a way to see the actual data, and preview over here will just show you the preview of the resource that you got back.